점수 잡는 hackers.
Hi guys, we'll be working on lesson 2. We're going to finish off that lesson 1 stuff that we're working on from model 1, question 22 to 27. These are not grammar type questions, so we'll be working on those reading comprehension as well. These are all transitions and rhetorical synthesis types, so pay attention to these question types as well, okay? So let's jump straight to the questions, number 22. Since this is a transition type, we're gonna focus on the context as well. All right, let's start with the first sentence. In April 2010, one of the largest environmental disasters in history occurred. Okay, so the main point is you gotta pay attention to the main verb of the sentences, to skim fast, okay? So there's an event that happened. When, okay, so that's detail. High pressure gas caused a massive explosion aboard. All right, so we know for sure that it's an explosion that happened, but that equals with the word disaster. So don't spend too much time reading all the details. Now let's move on. The CEO of BP. Now guys, what happened here is it's no longer focusing on the disaster itself, but it changed the subject, okay? It's talking about the CEO of a company. The company in charge of the rig claimed no responsibility. Okay, so that's the main point. So even if this event happened, the person is claiming no responsibility at all and also arguing that itself and the personnel aboard were part of another company. Okay, so one main thing, the subject has changed. Now, what you want to focus on is grouping the answer choices. That's very, very main for the transition types. What it means to group is there are 3 types of groupings. The first type is called continuation, okay? Which means the previous sentence continues on to the next sentence. It could be an example, it could be a summary, or it could be some detail. But there is a difference if you have contrast grouping. Obviously, the name speaks for itself. It brings opposite relationship. It could be a condition like however. And the last is the previous sentence becomes the cause and the following part becomes the effect. So this is the cause and effect grouping, which shows the reason and the result. So let's group them. Likewise is, of course, continuation because it shows similar ideas. But continuation has several sub-functions. So let's write that down as well. Likewise would show similarity, kind of like similarly. That's also an adverb. And also, alternately is a contrast. It shows different options, okay? And afterward is also continuation. This is pretty tricky. Afterward is showing something that happens in the aftermath. So it shows time. So that would be sequence, okay? Time order, chronology. And the last continuation, similarly, also similarity. All right, so we group them up. Now what we want to do is you want to see which part doesn't work and contrast wouldn't because it's the CEO. But if you have 2 similar or identical continuation with subgroups, that couldn't be the answer because you only have one answer. So the best answer is what happened after the disaster. The CEO refused to admit that it was his fault. So the answer is C. All right, let's move on to the next part, 23. Let's start with the first sentence. By 1947, Las Coques became one of France's most popular art galleries. All right, so it explains that it's a very popular gallery as, and this would be the meaning of since, right? Because tourists throng to the cave to marvel at the ancient cave drawings. All right, now the second is air conditioning. Now that's a different subject. Maybe it could be a reason why it's popular. Let's read. Control the underground temperatures and provided oxygen for the 1,800 daily visitors. Before long, the humidity and carbon dioxide resulted in the growth of mold and lichen that began to obscure. Now, this is our major hint, guys. What does the word obscure mean? It means to negatively affect, to make it less of an impact. So it obscures is completely the opposite of popular. So air conditioning showed how people were able to throng to these galleries and made it popular, but the latter part shows how it began to decline in terms of effect. So it could be contrasting relationship, okay? So let's move on to see the groupings. Now, at any rate is a very tricky one, Now this is contrast. It corrects an earlier misstatement. So when you're talking about a statement, and then you want to change it up, you say at any rate B. So it shows condition. What about B? Of course, contrast. And what about C? Furthermore, continuation. It adds additional information, right? Extra information. And then last of all, you've got still. This is also tricky, so I'm going to put a little star next to it. Still and yet go together. So memorize this in the same way. Still yet shows contrast grouping. So as I said, contrast could be one main information, but in this case, you have to think about whether it's correcting something. No, it's actually not. So in this case, the best answer would be between though and still. But what's the difference? Though shows that even though the conditions of air conditioning controlled it, before long, something happened. So it shows opposite, contrasting ideas. So that's why the best answer is B. Hello guys, we'll be working on lesson 3 from test 1, model 2, questions 17 to 27. This is the entire model, so we'll be focusing on all question types for the writing section. All right, let's jump straight to the questions. 17. When Scott Joplin was born in 1867. Now guys, when you see the word when, it's a conjunction, which means it usually connects a dependent clause to an independent clause. So to be more exact, it could be called a subordinating conjunction category, right? Subordinate means it makes it attached to an IC as a dependent clause. All right, so when Scott Joplin was born, now that would be a dependent clause, nobody could have expected him to compose operas. Okay, so this would be a subject. Could have expected could be the verb, which means it's an IC, independent clause, connected to a dependent clause. However, what we want to focus on is the following sentence, because it has the blank in it. The son of a former slave and a free-born African-American housekeeper. Now, you guys notice something right here. Before the comma, they do not have a main predicate verb, which means it cannot be an independent clause. However, right after the comma, you see a subject, and then you see a verb, which means the following part could be the independent clause. So in order to figure out what this dependent clause signifies, you have to look at the answer choices. Right, let's look at A, B, C, and D. For A, when they raised shows a different subject in hand. It talks about a plural subject. However, in this case, it talks about the son of a former slave, which is a singular. So as you can see, the subject does not match with each other. What about B, raised? Now it looks like a pretty good verb form. What about C, raising? Now guys, one thing you notice about this, raised and raising, have two entirely different meanings. Raised means you were the object of becoming raised, while raising, it means that you're the subject of conducting that behavior. You raised someone would be what it means. So in that case, raising would not be talking about Joplin, so that would be a dangling modifier. But what about having raised? As it goes with C, these are both talking about the subject of raising the son. So in order to match it with Joplin, who was raised as an object of the parents, the only answer that we can choose would be B. Right? So for this question, you have to figure out what's the introductory clause, which is the dependent clause that's highlighted in red. All right, let's move on to question 18. This is also a standard English convention type, so you'll focus on the grammar part. Now, when you go into the test center, you guys won't have a lot of time to waste. So it's really pretty strategic to jump straight to the question in hand. Clearly, further study, okay, we've got a subject, is, we've got a verb, required, and then we've got an infinitive form. Now, when you have a 2 plus verb form, it's called an infinitive. It looks like a verb because of the verb form that follows, but it actually does not function as verbs. It could be a noun, it could be an adjective, or it could be an adverb. So in this case, it provides detailed explanation of the purpose of what's required. Whether Gurion or Elliot. Now you see, whether A or B. Think about whether this should be considered singular or plural. Let's check out A, B, C, and D. Are, is being, and have been. Now what you notice about these answer choices is they have different verb forms. When we see verb form questions, it can be either a tense shift question. They're asking you, does it change in terms of tense? Or it could be asking you, is it a subject or a verb agreement question? It has to agree in number. So if the subject is a singular, you have to match that up with a verb. Or if it's plural, you have to match that up with a verb as well. Another is, you have to figure out whether it's a main predicate verb or whether you need a verbal form, like an infinitive or a gerund or a participle. So in this case, what you notice is subject-verb agreement could be applicable, but it also has progressive form, and it also has different tense forms. So you have to check out all of them. Now, one thing that you guys need to note is usually the SATs don't like to test you guys on the progressive form. If there's a simple tense, always go with that. Don't go with the progressive form ing. Okay? So let's go back. It is required to determine whether Gurion or Elliot blank. Now, or A or B is considered usually as a singular. So considering that you don't need a tense shift because you don't have any tense shift clues in the sentence, then it's either going to be A or B, but as I said, it's a singular. So you match it up and it would be B. So it's a subject-verb agreement plus a tense form question. Pretty simple. Hello guys, this is Nayan. We'll be working on our fourth lesson today. It's test 2, model 1 from question 15 to 20. These are all standard English convention types, so we'll be focusing on those grammatical rules again. All right, let's start with the first question, 15. Now this is a grammar type of question, which means you do not start from the beginning. You start right here where the question is being asked. Okay, so let's start. Finding looks like a verb, but it has an ing form attached to it. Now, simply put, if you have a verb ing form, these are usually differentiated as verbal forms. Verbals can be divided into two types as well. The first is participle, which looks like a noun, but it can function as an adjective. Another form that you see as a verb ing would be a gerund form. This acts as a noun. So in this case, since it starts off the sentence divided by a comma, you know that it's a participle form showing a dependent clause. Okay, so in order for a dependent clause to exist, it has to be attached to an independent clause. So let's read on. Now, you don't see any subject or verb. You notice a relative pronoun, that. Now, if you have a relative pronoun, it shows that it's not the main predicate verb, but it's a relative clause that follows. So the relative clause starts and says, oxygen levels during the Mesoproterozoic were a tiny fraction of what scientists had believed. So this entire thing is a clause. So now, in order to figure out what should come here, think about the basic components of an independent clause. You need a subject, and you also need a verb. All right, so let's check out what the question answer choices are. Now, you can differentiate the subject and a verb for each choice. The first subject for A would be researchers. Concluded would be a past tense verb form. You've got conclusions, which is the subject, and then you've got were drawn as the verb. You've also got the researchers' conclusions. Now you see an apostrophe, which shows possessive form. So it divides up to conclusion, and then the verb were. And then finally, for D, you've got the subject research, and then you've got the word concluded, past verb form. Now you see different subjects and verbs, but the only hint that we have is you need a subject and a verb, but you also have a dependent clause that starts the sentence. Now usually when a dependent clause is used, at the beginning of a sentence, SATs are asking you to figure out the introductory modifier and what that modifier is trying to modify. Okay, so that's usually going to be the subject that follows. Now, there are two main errors that you'll see in a modifier type of question. The first is misplaced modifier. The name speaks for itself. If you're trying to talk about the action or condition of a subject, they have to be located in close proximity. Now, for dangling modifier, dangling means it's just hanging there. It's missing a word. So in other words, it's missing the subject or noun that's supposed to show the action or condition. All right, so in this case, finding no such evidence. So who or what can be the subject of finding the evidence? It's not going to be the conclusions. It has to be something that could find. So it's going to be a human being figure. So the best answer in this case would be A, okay? Now let's just review these modifier errors one more time. There are words that modify their sentences' meanings. Typically, it's important to know that they are placed right beside the noun they're modifying. Usually it just means right before or just right after the noun. Now again, two errors. The first is called misplaced modifier. They bought a car for my sister they call Pumpkin. Now this modifier, are we talking about the sister or are we talking about the car? It's not very clear, is it? So that would be a misplaced modifier error. Now for a dangling modifier, it doesn't modify any specific word, so it's missing that word. In this case, after reading the book, okay, so that's the beginning introductory modifier. But who's reading the book? Not the movie, is it? So it's missing the reader, which is the subject that's supposed to be reading the book. All right, let's move on to the next question, number 16. Right, so this is also a grammar type, so we should start off right here. In part, which just means partially, this is, we've got our subject and a verb, because, okay? Now we've got the basic components of an independent clause. Let's continue reading. Few intact specimens are generated in the worm-forested ecosystems. That we've got a relative clause, opened up with a relative pronoun. Would have made up proto-bads. You see an apostrophe, which means that it's a possessive form, which means there's an ownership of a noun that follows. So for sure, we know that there's a noun that should come right after. But then we continue reading. Now always, when you're trying to check out the following sentence, try to see whether this is an IC or a DC, the same rule applies. If you see a subject and a verb, then that's going to be distinguished as an independent clause. Let's see how it is. These challenging conditions, okay, this is an adjective, but it's connected to this noun. So conditions could be the subject. Also, account for. Account for means it can explain. Explain. So that's also a verb. You've got the subject and the verb, which makes it an independent clause. So in total, there are two independent clauses, right before the blank and right after the blank. Now let's think about some ways to connect this as two independent clauses. Now one of the most common errors that they love to test you guys would be comma splice, which is you have two independent clauses, but you split it up with a comma. And that's not grammatically correct. And also one more, you've got two independent clauses, but you do not have any punctuation in between. That's also wrong. We call that a run-on error, right? The independent clauses runs on and on without any punctuation to stop them. Now these are most commonly tested errors, but in this case, we notice something right here. Indeed, indeed. Now, indeed, you've guys seen this quite often in one of those transition type of questions. In fact, they're both used as conjunctive adverbs. So they are adverbs, but they have the function of a conjunction. They connect two independent clauses. So in this case, even if you have indeed, as long as you differentiate that from the IC that follows, it's fine to use it as an adverb, kind of like a transitional word. All right, so you've got an IC and an adverb and an IC. So can we use this? No, you can't, because You don't want to splice two independent clauses. And what about this? Can we use that as well? No, because the adverbs have to be differentiated from the independent clause. So in this case, it's missing commas. So it's a missing punctuation error. So the best answer that shows that indeed can be attached to an independent clause, and it can also be divided by a semicolon, and it's also differentiated by a comma from the IC. So the best answer is A. And before we move on, let's check out what the conjunctive adverbs actually mean. Right, so they are one or more words used to join two independent clauses. As I said, the main part is they join two ICs. These words are technically adverbs, but they perform the same linking function as conjunctions, and that's why they're called conjunctive adverbs. The known examples would be after all, besides, consequently, finally, however, which is the most frequently tested adverb, nevertheless, then, therefore. Now, you notice something about these transition words, adverbs? They are frequently tested in your transition types. And when a conjunctive adverb unites two independent clauses in one sentence, it can be preceded by a semicolon and followed by a comma. Remember the function of these two? Semicolon is used to differentiate the two ICs, like that. And the comma is used to differentiate the adverb from the IC, like that. But where the semicolon should come, like before the adverb or after the adverb, depends on the translation of the meaning. So let's say they use the transition however. Now, if the beginning sentence, so the left part of the sentence has the meaning of contrast, then you should place however at the latter part of the sentence. But if it has a different meaning, if the contrast is in the right side of the semicolon, then you should place however at the beginning of the sentence of your second IC. All right, so always pay attention to the context as well.
토익은 해커스, 영어도 해커스, 고득점 메이커스, 만점을 받아 버렸어. 토익은 해커스, 영어도 해커스.